There are a lot of different ways that you can apply marks when you're working with ink. Today, I'm going to go over 7 strategies. Most of these are hatching related, but not all of them. So we're going to take a look at a conical structure, almost like a stalactite or a stalagmite, and how we might shade that or hatch that or texture that using ink. So I've got a bunch of different strategies here. We're going to go ahead and dive straight in. The first one we're working with is pretty standard, and that's just vertical hatching. We're going to keep the vast majority of our marks going vertically along the side of this structure. I am imagining that this is not particularly smooth, that this structure is probably made of stone deposited in a cave over a long period of time. You might be wondering why I, mention that, why that's something worth thinking about. But I think whenever you're working with ink, because it is so particular and specific in how you're applying each mark, it's not a bad idea to have some idea of what it is that you're working on. Understanding the actual physical structure of a thing is going to help out a lot. So I'm just going to kind of go around and put these marks on this shape. You can see there's some sense of order to things, but really I'm just trying to make sure I have a darker marks along the sides, as if it's implying that the light source might be coming from here or from the opposite. But it's also understanding that each of these little segments that seem to come out like this is obviously going to cast a shadow underneath itself. And that's basically what we're implying. That's a big thing to consider whenever you're working with ink, and particularly when you're working with texturing or with hatching like this, is you are implying texture. You are implying shading. You're not really actually putting shading on something. And that might be a subtle thing to mention and to process, but that's what drawing is. Drawing is not an actual representation of a thing. It's a fictional representation of a thing, and it is a representation. It is not the actual thing itself. So we are just trying to find strategies that seem to imply what we want to imply. You'll also notice that while my marks are vertical, they are also leaning a little bit in line with the object, and I think that's key. You could do this with only vertical marks. It's going to have far more of an etching design or a graphic design element to it than it is a realistic. You can see how this delivers that idea to us though. And this is an understandable object. I've darkened in some portions a little bit more than others, and perhaps smoothing those out is going to make things look a little bit nicer. But I think that finishes off this first one, our vertical hatching. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one. So this one we've got curved hatching, and these curved marks are going to basically allow us to understand that we are looking at this structure a little bit from above it. So this structure is below us, and so we are going to assume that these lines are essentially wrapping around that face. And this is going to put it in perspective. And that really does help with establishing the presence of whatever kind of scene it is that you're putting together. It is going to be easier and different to make these kinds of marks because your wrist wants to pivot in this way. So these marks are going to be easier for me to make than their opposite, which we'll get to in a little while. Some of these marks you can have come much more across the object. In fact, if you had something like a crack, you could actually do this and then shade underneath it with your hatching, as if it is casting a shadow on the space below it. But I'm going to start here just along the edge, and I like leaving that little piece of almost a halo, that highlight along the edge. That implies that perhaps there are other objects in this cave or in this scene that are reflecting their light back on it. It just gives it a little bit more authenticity. But now I'm going to come along the other side, and I'm going to keep these marks a little bit more sparse, as if the light, perchance, is coming more from this side than the other. And as I go down, I'm going to just finish out this edge work, and then I'm going to start going into the center. Because inevitably, in the structures that I'm working on right now, there are going to be some undulations and modifications to the structure. It's not perfectly smooth. In fact, doing perfectly smooth things with ink is often very difficult. and can be one of the final stages of learning how to master those skills. I'm going to keep going here and just keep applying some marks. If you do little ones that are disassociated with or unattached to everything else on the middle, it will just make it seem like there's a little bit more texture there. I'm realizing as I look at this guy that I could continue to add a little bit more texture along this and shading along this left-hand side, and that will make it look a little bit better. There's not really a problem with taking your shading or your hatching all the way up against the edge. It will just make it look a little bit different. And I would encourage you to try that. See which one you prefer. And sometimes inside of a singular drawing, there will be situations where one works better than the other. That kind of stuff just comes from some manner of experience, or just differentiating so that not everything matches perfectly in your drawing. You can see that works pretty well. And we're definitely looking down on this object, but having it in some sense of perspective makes it feel a little bit more authentic and easy to understand. Now this next one, we're actually going to work on just horizontal hatching. And the reason I'm doing this is because it looks bad. And sometimes showing you what something looks like when it's incorrect or not done particularly well is going to give you a reason for why these two alternatives on either side are going to be a better option most of the time. So if you were looking at this stalactite or stalagmite or conical structure exactly from the side, where all of your marks are going to be 100% horizontal, it is going to look quite a bit different. I would pretty much never do this, mostly because it's just the most boring way there is to draw this, but it can still work. And I'm going to go through it anyway, even though I would very highly recommend that you take objects and put them in some semblance of perspective. The reality here is that generally, even if you were looking at an object like this, maybe the center of it would be exactly at your eye level, but as the lines go up, they'll start to subtly curve, just like if you're looking up at a skyscraper, where the top of it is going to look almost like this. It seems like it's getting smaller as it's getting away from you, even though perhaps you're standing right here at the bottom. But on this one, we're going to try to just keep our lines horizontal and see what that looks like. It's still a strategy that could be applied sometimes, though I've kind of jokingly kept it here as like maybe 3, and in my notes it was like 2.5, because it's just not a strategy I would recommend. It doesn't look as good as the others generally. And you can kind of tell that as you're looking at it here. It's hard to isolate and understand where the light's coming from, how the texture is functioning. It makes it more difficult to tell what you're looking at. And in general, when you're drawing, because it is an illusion that you're trying to represent in some capacity, you don't want to embark on paths that are going to make it more difficult to communicate what you're communicating. So let's try a crack like we did on the one prior, and then we'd have our horizontal lines underneath it to help imply what's happening there. Maybe even take this out on the side and bulge that out so it makes a little bit more sense what we're doing. And that does help a little bit. I'm going to come down here and re-emphasize some of these lines. But it does work. In my mind, though, it's just not as satisfying as the others. But I feel like it's not a bad idea to show it, and this explains why I would generally encourage artists to have some semblance of perspective in their pieces, because that's the way we look at the world. When you're looking at things right now, there are things that you can see the tops of and things that you can't see the tops of, maybe things that you see the bottom of, and that's just how we interpret the world, so it makes more sense to take those things and kind of embed them. If you did want to have something exactly on the side like that, I would recommend hatching more like this. Let's move on to number 3 then, the opposite of number 2. We're going to hatch the opposite direction. So I'm going to start here with the outline, though I want to state that you don't need to start with an outline. There are some benefits actually from not doing that. And I also want to mention that this is a Pigma Micron 01. It is a 0.25 millimeter pen, very common. It's the one that I use for most of these, though I have a lot of them. This is generally the pen that I will use for demonstrations because it's widely accessible and it just eliminates things that might give me an advantage and might accidentally be leading you on the wrong path. So I'm coming up along the side here, and again, I'll draw the pencil lines just for instructional purposes. So this is the idea here. This is a stalactite or stalagmite that is rising above us. Our character or our perspective is down below. And so these lines will appear to wrap around and wrap away from us. So I'm going to come up the side here, and I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. And I am actually going to have these marks on this side go all the way to the edge. So there is no bound slide on that side, but alternatively, it's just a different way of showing this. I'm going to have some of these lines go a little bit further across. There's a lot of different strategies, even inside of a single form of hatching. And that's part of the reason why I'm doing this video, because no matter how many times we talk about this or I make a video on different hatching techniques, the reality is applying them to a conical structure is different than applying them to round structures or stones or rocks. And the more you do it, the more familiar it becomes and the better you get at it. So you can tell, again, this makes a little bit more sense than our middle one. It starts to really feel as if it's in some kind of space. I'm going to start taking some longer lines here coming across. And that should continue to allow us to see how this structure is shaped. I am limiting myself to only particular hatching marks on a drawing like this, but if I was doing this for myself, there's a good chance that I would use some alternative hatching structures. It makes sense when you're going through this kind of instruction to limit what you're doing, but in reality, sometimes it's best to use multiple different ones. If you have a space on a structure like this where the direction changes, for example, maybe there's a cutout or a divot out of something, it's not a bad idea then to shift up the direction your marks are going. You know, if you had something along the side where there's a chunk missing, so let's say I've got my curved marks, the vast majority of my marks are curving around like this, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to have something like this where you actually change the direction that your marks are going to show that that's a cutout, it's a divot of some kind. And that's exactly what these lines are doing. They're showing us the contour, the shape, the physical structure of this object. And so when you change the direction of your marks, you are communicating something to a viewer. And that's a powerful mechanism. All right, let's move on to the next one then. This is going to be a little bit goofier, perhaps, but I have recently become fond of marks that are not just hatching, probably because hatching is something that's been in my wheelhouse for a very, very long time. And so it's kind of fun now to work with different strategies. This is as simple as it looks. And the biggest piece of advice I would give here is you have to give this time to materialize. As I go down the side of this, it will often look like nothing. It will look like I'm just messing around. And that's fine. But as I continue to work with it, continue to bring in these squiggly shapes, it will apply a very particular texture to this object. It will start to feel like the surface of this object is made of bubbles or cracked material or something like coral. And that's the lovely part about applying different kinds of marks on your ink work, is it will give it an innate texture. If everything in your drawing is hatching, it might imply some texture, but really what it's going to imply is it's going to just imply that this is the mechanism that you chose in order to shade this piece. But here, if you have something that is hatched and then you have another object that has this texture, it is really sending a strong message that this object is fundamentally different. Its surface texture is very different than the neighboring objects. Like I mentioned there, this one does take a little bit of time to kind of come into its own. Most of the time that I'm working on this, it feels like, what am I doing? Am I wasting my time? But the more that I work on it, the more that I continue to layer, come in here and make these shadows deeper and darker, maybe add a chunk here in the middle where maybe there is a divot of some kind that's cut out, it will start to really come into its own and feel like a decent strategy. And again, this is something that I would not apply as the only texture on a piece. I would generally have other forms of hatching and use this in deep shadows or use this to imply some kind of texture. I've been using this recently on scaled creatures. So for dragons and dinosaurs and monsters and things like that. I wouldn't use this all that much when it comes to drawing something like a robot, where you're going to want smoother transitions from one form to another. But we'll go ahead and finish this one up. Another thing you can vary here is the size of your squiggles. If you have big ones versus really small ones, those are going to do different things. And if you think of this form as reducing to its like most minute form, it's probably just going to be tiny little notches and dots, which you can use in the lighter areas to imply that that texture is still there. It's just catching a lot more of the light. All right, for this next one, we are going to use several different directions of hatching. It's still very much in the same train of thought of the other hatching techniques, but can just be a little bit more variance. So perhaps you are thinking of the surface is moving kind of like this if we were going to look on the outside. And so you have constantly changing faces, and you can achieve that appearance by shifting the direction that your hatching is going. You still want to be very aware of the fact that where you concentrate more of these marks, it is going to communicate that that area is in shadow or darker. And wherever you have two different forms of hatching meeting, like this, it's going to imply that this is a plane and that this is a different plane. And that can be an issue if you're doing it kind of all willy-nilly and not thinking about what you're doing, but it is actually part of the advantage here too, is every time you shift, it implies more, and it's not a ton of extra work. So you can communicate a more intricate form, a more interesting form, by alternating your marks without actually having to do a ton of thought. But like I said, if you turn off your brain and you're not thinking about it at all, you can actually end up with something that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then the eyes of your viewers will see that and will be taken out of the piece. Well, what happens if we have a chunk here where we've got a divot or a cutout of some kind? Well, let's see what happens. We're going to kind of do this area around it here. And then I'm going to have these marks go oppositionally to the ones above. And then we're going to turn these. And again, I'm just varying the concentration of lines. And this area obviously looks much darker because it's got a higher concentration of the marks. But each of those shifts is also implying that there's a plane shift there. This is, again, one of those techniques that I have been employing more lately, and I rather enjoy because it allows the human brain to do a lot of interpreting when they're looking at it. It's not quite as restrictive as some of the other methodologies, and I've found a lot of fun in this. So I would recommend it. 6, we are going to go with vertical contour hatching. So this is very similar to our first, except we're actually going to allow our lines to bend as they wrap around it. This is pretty much the same thing we were looking at here. If you had this object, actually exactly what we're looking at here, where if this object continued down, eventually those lines would become straight, and then eventually way down further, they would start to curve away from us. So we're gonna do that same kind of thing here, but on a vertical structure. And you could do this one and practice on that. I would recommend it. So we're gonna start off with curved lines, mostly coming around the side, but I like to have one kind of at the beginning that is going to serve as our benchmark. So these marks are curving, and then the ones on the other side are curving the other way. This is also going to kind of imply that the structure on the side of this object is maybe looking like this, where you've got kind of this corrugated structure. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, having these distinctions is going to make it feel like each object in your drawings is a little bit more interesting or unique. And that can certainly be a good thing to invest time into if you spend a lot of time drawing with ink. This is something that is a lot easier to do with a pencil or with watercolor or with paint or digital, with something that allows for really even transitions and gradients and fades. But it can be one of those things that's a little bit difficult when it comes to ink drawing. And this is a fun way to do this, to just differentiate your structures in some way, have the perspective shift and change as you move through them. And honestly, if you have a lot of different surfaces in a drawing, using different techniques for each one, or not every one, because that could get a little bit crazy, using different forms of texture for like kinds of objects can help anybody who's looking at your pieces understand what it is they're looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this guy out. This is a fun technique. This is probably one that you would use predominantly on a central object, but could also be used if you have a corrugated kind of texture on them, like I mentioned above. So that would be kind of our sixth. And then our seventh is actually going to be pretty quick. This is going to be the idea that we want to be fairly minimalistic with the way that we're shading things in. There's going to be a lot of comics that are going to use a strategy more like this. It's probably my least favorite of the bunch, but there are times where it works really well, specifically when you're working on structures that are highly reflective or smooth. And so it's going to be not using any hatching really. It's just going to be focusing on high areas of contrast. So I'm going to find areas here where you've got subtle plane shifts on the object, right there. And of course you could control these really thoroughly when you're working on things. And I'm also going to be thinking about this object. I'm looking down on it, so I'm above this object. Give myself those lines just to kind of help with the understanding of how the structure is working. If it helps too, to think about where to place your marks, you could do this as well, where you actually have a topographic map of your object. If you do things like this and you really want to get complicated, you can go way overboard here and create some really cool stuff. But for now, we're going to keep it pretty simple. I'm thinking about my light source coming from primarily above, but a little bit more to the right. So I'm going to start with just a solid amount of shadow coming down this way. And particularly here, again, at these plane shifts. And I am not going to be doing any hatching here. This is only going to be working on just putting in some dark blackout shading. It's going to be very, very different than what we have been working with so far. And again, a strategy I don't use very often, and a strategy that works really well in tandem with other strategies. Imagine doing this for some of the darkest shadows on your drawing and then working in different forms of hatching to accentuate them. That would work really, really well. But again, I'm using all of these in isolation for this demonstration because I feel like that is the best way to handle it. Combining them is the exercise that I would recommend afterwards. If you were in class with me right now, that would be our homework. Or what we would go into right after this is immediately trying to take 2 or 3 of these and putting them together. Imagine creating a grid, perhaps, of how all of these would intersect with one another, and then practicing that. And that would actually be really good practice. If you want to try to employ some of these and see how these strategies work, that's what I would recommend. Just try incorporating number 1 and number 4, number 5 and number 7, and see what happens. Obviously, if you really think about it, like number 2, 3, and the second 3 are all really the same strategy, just depending on the angle you're looking at things from. So I would not combine those too much. I am working on just putting some dots in here too, because they are essentially the same thing. They are just little areas of black. They're kind of a stand-in for our hatching here, and will allow this to look a little bit more interesting. Again, this strategy might not look like much, but if you've got really strong shadows on a piece, this can be a really good way to handle things. This is pretty subtle, the way that I'm doing it right now, but it can be really stark. And I've certainly used really heavy shadows in some of my drawings, especially the robot drawings where I've got really dynamic plane shifts. But this pretty much finishes off our 7 strategies for today on adding texture and shading to your drawings on conical forms. So let me know in the comments below if there was anything here that was helpful, anything that I missed or need to explain more thoroughly, and of course, what you would like me to cover next. I hope that this has been beneficial to you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon, and have fun with your drawings.